Hello, everyone. I'm here with Susanne Currid for the second of our three discussions about art history meets history. And Susanne has just been awarded her MA from Sussex University, first class, and she this is about a very famous painting described in the Irish Times as the jewel in the crown, or a jewel in the crown, of the Crawford Gallery Art Gallery in Cork, and it is a view of Cork from Audley Place by John Butts. And I've been looking at what's been written about the painting, and the angle that Susanne has developed, it seems to me to be a scoop. I'm a journalist, so I speak in these terms. And despite the fact that it's very well known, she's come up with it with a different angle on it, and we're going to be talking about that today. And I'll just introduce Susanne and ask her to say the name of her give us the title of her thesis.
So what I called it was Reframing the View, Visuality, Colonialism and the Politics of Representation as seen in John Butt's View of Cork from Audley Place.
Yeah, great. Okay. So, and just to say before I put a few questions to her, that she consulted the Crawford Art Gallery and the curators there, and Cork City Museum and the archives at UCC, University College Cork, and also at the Cork City Library. And she's spent quite a lot of time living in Waterford, isn't it? So not a million miles away from Cork. So the first question I wanted to ask you, Susanne, was about colonial power in Cork, and how does your approach to this painting, which we think dates back to 1750, how does your approach to this painting bring out aspects which the historians hadn't really looked at, but which you found?
Okay, I guess my work or the analysis that I've taken is inspired by what's now known as the visual turn. So back in the 1990s, historians started to realize that there had been a missed opportunity in terms of looking at images as sources or as visual text. So art historian theorists such as Michael Baxendale, he said there's actually an opportunity to decode the meanings within paintings and re-look at them again as sites of power and contestation. And also they can be instruments of culture. They can actually have an effect. They can be used to bolster identities and to support ideologies. And this is the approach that I took when looking at the View of Cork from Audley Place. And landscapes in particular really lend themselves to this approach. So before I started my master's, I was sort of weighing up, will I do history? Will I do art history? I've always been a massive fan of both. And it was a real struggle to think, well, what should I do? But in the end, I found this approach, this visual turn approach to looking at visual culture or visual material that really sort of sat very comfortably with my personal interests. And so from that perspective, I went on this amazing journey with this painting. I've been looking at it intently for probably the best part of 6 months, and it keeps giving up new pieces of information, and I think, historians more broadly are starting to come around to this idea of analysing visual culture in order as a sort of an additional way or an alternative way or getting new insights to history from the past. So, art, people may think of art history as it's about the aesthetic or it's about the biography of the painter, but I think it's so interesting to look at how it can be used to support ideologies and identities, as I was talking about before. So with that in mind, I'd like to share the painting on screen, and I can maybe start to talk about what I found in terms of how the painting represented colonialism, or especially the view of the Anglo-Irish elite Protestants who were the colonizers and settlers in Ireland during this era.
That would be very interesting. Yeah, please. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm probably not going to describe all the different elements, but I'm just going to pick out a few for this video and just start to explain how this painting was instrumentalized. So in this era, so we're looking at somewhere between 1750 and 1760, Cork was known as the sort of the provisions house of Ireland. It was exporting butter and beef in massive quantities to all corners of the world, most especially the West Indies. Um, if you look to the hills in the back of the painting, they look particularly empty, I would say. So green fields to the left and the right in the background. But at this time, these fields would have been completely filled with herds of black cattle, which are typical of the area. And they were either creating butter, which was then salted and barreled and sent abroad, or they were being slaughtered in the abattoir, which was basically on this hill. You can see a hill on the right-hand side, and there's a church steeple popping out at the top. So just to the other side of that hill was what was described at the time by Charles Smith as one of the largest, well, the largest abattoir in Ireland, where black cattle were being slaughtered in the tens of thousands, especially between the months of September and December. So when you know that history and you look at this painting, you start to realize that what we're getting here is quite a sanitized view. There's not a sign of livestock anywhere in sight, and not even a dot of a cow in the distance. I mean, I've seen other landscape paintings from a very similar era where cattle have been painted into the scene, both in the foreground and the background. So considering Cork's history at this time, I sort of see this as a particularly interesting omission. So people, certainly theorists, would look at this omission as a way of sanitizing the landscape, to try and instead show the civilizing influence of the settlers at this time, that this was a calm and sanitized environment, which was a delight for the local Anglo-Irish elite to live within. If you are to sort of look at the foreground as well, it all looks very sort of bucolic. And the painter, John Butts, has used lots of techniques for composition that were initially promoted by Claude Lorraine, the famous French landscape painter. So he's very much influenced by Claude Lorraine in the way that he puts this painting together. We've got a very definitive foreground, midground, and background. He's used darker, richer colours in the foreground and sort of fading through to the background to give this sense of perspective. He then has a little tree on the left-hand side, which sort of acts like a wing. They call it a coulis, and it sort of again adds to the perspective that we're seeing here. And then the River Lee meanders through the centre of the painting, and that creates this sort of more calming effect as well. The interesting thing about this painting is this is not actually how Cork looks. What John Butts has done is he has taken Shandon on the right-hand side, this hill that you see with the church steeple at the top, and he's shunted it into the closer to the city centre, so that he is able to focus on these parts of the city that he wanted to tell a story about. I'll talk more about that in some of the subsequent questions that we're talking about, but I think it's really interesting to see how much that this is actually an artificial construction, which allowed him to place buildings and architecture in a way that helped him to tell a narrative that was meaningful both to him and to a potential buyer or viewer of this painting.
Yeah, great. Yeah, just one quick follow-up question on that, just because the people watching this might be interested. Which was the first incongruity or bit of sanitization that leapt out at you first when you looked at this?
I think it was the fields, to be honest. I mean, I've read a lot about enclosures and the way agriculture has been developed, the history of agriculture in Britain. I've read about the Scottish clearances and enclosures over time. I'm really interested in land ownership and power around land. So that immediately sort of piqued my attention. I come from my father managed herds of cattle in the past, and also that was just that sort of family interest in cattle, which maybe just putting those two things together made me sort of think, what's actually going on here?
Yeah, right, right. Okay. And just moving on, you compare the painting in your dissertation with two others from the same era, and you deduced from these comparisons certain religious and colonial tensions. And I wondered if you could explain to us how you deduced them, how you got to these conclusions.
Absolutely, I will do. Okay, so I'd like to introduce you to another image that was created contemporaneously to John Butt's View of Cork that we've just been looking at. This is an engraving based on a painting of a view by Anthony Chernsley, who was an up-and-coming landscape painter of that time. And it was engraved by Thomas Chambers, who was previously a well-known engraver and who practiced in Dublin in this era. Now, this image was commissioned by the Physico-Historical Society, and it was included as a pull-out illustration of the city in a book that surveyed Cork and its history at the time. Now, the purpose of the book was to encourage settlers to come to the city and to set up as linen producers or makers, and all sorts of other industries that the city was looking to attract to make it even more productive than it already was. So there was a different agenda with this engraving immediately. But what I was struck by is that this illustration of Cork and Butt's view are incredibly similar, and also of an incredibly similar era. And talking to people in Cork, both at the Crawford and at the Public Museum, there was this question mark as to which image came first and how they influenced each other. So I set about sort of exploring both of these images, a bit like a detective trying to deduct what was the relationship between the two. So as I started to examine them further, and with some support from Tom Spalding, who's a local historian based in Cork, we realised that this drawing probably anteceded Butts's painting. So it's likely that Butts based his painting on this view. But he made some judicious changes. And so I was really trying to understand why he made those changes. So to help me understand that, I started to look at things like the figures in both images and also the churches and the way that they were presented. So as an example, in Chambers' view, the churches which appear in the centre of the town are actually raised up so that you can see them more clearly. And it's not just the Anglo-Irish churches, but also the dissenting churches of the Quakers and the Methodists and the Unitarians. But then there's a really different treatment to the front of the painting, where in Butts's view, you see two figures looking out over the view and pointing to St. Anne's, which had been recently newly constructed. The tower had literally been built in 1749. So it was a brand new moment of civic pride. You can see in this engraving that the top of the steeple is not yet built, which actually appears in Butts's painting. So again, that's a really good clue as to which came first and which came second. So in Chambers and Chernley's view, we see figures at the foreground who are, I would say, performing particular types of function which relate to identities that the Psychohistorical Society wanted to promote. So there are some figures coming up the hill which appear to be pulling each up over the edge. And I would see that as sort of as a representation of, this is an opportunity. This is a city where there is opportunity for people to pull themselves up literally in life and to do better for themselves. We see a male and female couple in the foreground in the engraving. And this is suggestions of marital potential and romance and the development of family life. And then we see two other figures looking over a wall more in the midground. And they're pointing to the city, not the church. And they're, I think, suggesting that there's bounty, there's opportunity in this fast developing city. So in comparison, we then look back to Butts, but he's not pointing to the city. He's not thinking about enterprise. He's looking to the church or to Shandon, dependent on what view you might take. So I was sort of curious as to why there was that difference. When I looked into the history of Cork from this era, I realised that actually it was a hotbed of religious contestation. You know, often when we look at Irish history, we think, oh, well, it's, you know, the Catholics were under the heel of the British colonisers. But I think there's another element that's not often considered. I read a book on the 18th century by Ian McBride that really illuminated my view of what was happening in Cork in terms of religious contestations at this era. So he helped me to understand that the dissenting Protestant religions were causing the Anglo-Irish elite to quake in their boots, quite literally. We had John Wesley. He arrived in Cork literally the year before Butts' painting and the engraving were supposedly created, and he was preaching from the pulpit of a local Church of Ireland church, which caused an absolute outroar. There were actually mobs on the street. And the local elite, the Protestant elite, were so worried about how people were going to leave the Church of Ireland. I read some recollections from a local curate, John Lloyd, who was writing to the Bishop George Berkeley, who was locally based at the time. And he was trying to argue for the fact that we had to allow people like John Wesley to speak at the time, because if they didn't, he feared that people would leave the church left, right, and centre. They needed to show tolerance to the new religions. But the Anglo-Irish elite were not in the mood for showing tolerance at all. They felt that allowing for this more open-minded view of the world, which dissenting Protestant religions brought with them, would ultimately shake their traditional establishment to the core. So any sort of dissent was really causing lots of issues here. And I think potentially in Butts' painting, you know, looking to this new church, looking to the established order of the Church of Ireland, there's maybe a pointer here to say, don't look to the city, don't look to these sort of newfangled ideas about business and commerce, and keep your eye on the one true church.
Yes, so you have all this ferment underneath what looks like a rather placid landscape initially. Very interesting. Could I just go on to ask you what you see now in the image regarding the slave trade and Cork?
Yes, this was another sort of attempt at excavating the image to look for hidden narratives that are not well acknowledged. So, you know, going back to the histories that I was talking about previously about Cork being the centre for beef and butter production, but most especially salted beef. When I dug into that history further, I realised that much of this salted beef was heading for the West Indies, particularly, you know, the islands, Jamaica, but also the colonies of the Dutch and the French. And the more I looked into these histories, I realized that predominantly these foodstuffs, especially the salted beef, was being used to feed enslaved people on these islands. And the reason for that being was that the monoculture of sugar production was seen as the most important thing to focus land for within the islands in the West Indies. No allowance was made for growing foodstuffs for the enslaved people who also lived there, and for their slave owners too. Um, so much of the food that was eaten on these islands was actually imported, and the vast majority of it was coming from Cork. The French actually were one of the biggest importers of salted beef. And they changed the laws to make sure that even despite wars which were prevalent during this era, that they still had access to Irish beef, because there was a sort of a combination of the right weather and the right location, and the skill set that the Irish had long had in cattle rearing. The Irish were particularly good at creating salted beef for the lowest possible cost. The French just weren't able to match it. So this ties to the flight of the Earls. So when the English colonisers, especially during the Williamite Wars, a lot of the old Irish elite, old Irish Catholic elite, left Ireland. They couldn't stay on the island anymore. It was too dangerous for them. So they left in their droves, and they went to Spain and they went to France. And many of them ended up in cities like port cities like Saint Malo and La Rochelle, where they set up and they became factors for trade in the French Empire, and especially their colonial outposts. So these Catholic traders were buying beef from their Catholic counterparts. So about 20% of traders in Cork at this time were Catholic, and they were selling beef to their Catholic counterparts in France. And then that beef was being sent to feed the slaves. And they were actually in the Louis, the sort of notorious Code Noir of the Louis XIV era. They stipulated how much beef should be fed to an enslaved person each week. I think it was a couple of pounds each week. And this beef also, it wasn't good quality. It was usually the worst quality beef. So it was the hoofs, the heads. It really, I mean, it sounds pretty grim when you get into the history in further detail. And then the better beef was what was sent to the plantation owners, especially in the British West Indies. And also there was a sort of a broader swathe of skill set about salting provisions. So salted herring, salted fish also became part of the mix. So the Swedes and the Scots would send their herring to Cork, and Cork would then rebarrel it, because they were especially good at creating salted provisions that would last for a long time, up to 12 months. And then they would rebarrel all of this fish and send it off on the ships. So within Butt's view, you can see ships on the quays, but also you see the wealth of the buildings. These buildings look incredibly ornate. There's a lot of sort of Dutch influenced buildings. So, there were Dutch merchants literally living here, or their Mannerist style of architecture was being adopted, because you've got the Dutch, the French, the British coming back and forward. So this is why Cork became such a hive of activity at this period, and had the wealth to build these beautiful new buildings and this important infrastructure with the quays. Just beyond this painting, there was a massive natural harbour, probably at the time the biggest natural harbour in the world. And it was full of flotillas of ships that were all going Atlantic bound. And you can see as well sort of some signs in the painting of the ancillary industries that were related to the beef the beef trade. So down near the river, in the centre ground, at the base of the Shandon Hill, we can see what I think is a curry factory. It's actually on the map of the time. There's a road called Curry Factory. And curriers were those who created leather products off the back of the remains of the cattle that were butchered for beef. So they were making leather for saddles and boots and shoes and gloves and so forth. And we can sort of see the traces of that yard actually within the centre of the painting.
The evidence you found sounds very conclusive to me, I must say. I mean, those statistics about the trading of the beef over to the West Indies, and also there are other points that you make in your dissertation about what was coming back was rum, and there was a great increase in rum drinking dating from then. But there's going to be people who like their history pure and the history of pure Ireland, who won't necessarily be that pleased that this theory is, well, that your conclusions, not a theory, I think it's proven really, that your conclusions show that Ireland wasn't quite as pure as maybe people had hoped and separate from the slave trade. How controversial do you think this might be?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that historians have been looking at this history for decades now. I was really influenced by the work of Thomas Truxas, who did amazing work on the economics of the trade between Ireland and the West Indies. So this is all based on sound historical research. I think most people still haven't heard of it; they're just not aware of it. But I just find it really interesting. I do ponder, why have people ignored the historians to date? Why have they not taken this story seriously? But I think social change that we've seen through things like Black Lives Matter movement, and just generally, we are more open now to looking at hidden histories, erased histories, marginalized histories, and reconsidering them. And I think ultimately, my hope is that we are prepared or mature enough now to engage with the truth. And this is the truth of the matter. As your book, that you've written about your grandfather, telling the truth is dangerous.
Yeah, it's true.
But I think ultimately you still have to hold fast to telling the truth.
And I guess we've got opportunities now because we are talking about Ireland's attitude to slavery in the 250th celebrations of Daniel O'Connell's birth, and so admirably he was way ahead of his time, really, in opposing slavery. But we mustn't just let the whole Irish story be whitewashed. Sorry, that's a funny choice of word, but you know what I mean. Just because Daniel O'Connell got it right.
I mean, there's been a lot of celebration of the story of Frederick Douglass, who was who was contemporaneous to Daniel O'Connell. They actually met each other. Frederick Douglass was an escaped enslaved person who ended up in Ireland and toured Ireland for 3 months and printed two editions of his book in Ireland at the time. People were so taken up with his story about, he really put a human face to it.
But maybe in talking about Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell, there's the opportunity just to deepen the history and talking about what actually happened a bit more, the involvement and the battle that went on about should Ireland be involved or not. And that's just the last question I wanted to ask you was, what is the potential for more work to be done through the art history route on the history of the slave trade?
Well, I think, as I may have said previously, marginalized histories, erased histories, forgotten histories, part of the problem sometimes is that there's very little evidence, or there's very little written evidence. And visuals and visual culture can be helpful in helping to bridge those gaps. And so, like, for instance, in this painting, we can look at the agriculture, we can look at the architecture, we can look at the technologies and processes of empire, and we start to get these clues and signs as to how Cork was engaged with this trade. it's not maybe the most overt way of talking about the story, but I still think it's an important, so it's a really useful entry route to having this conversation. And as a society, we become more and more visual. Maybe this also is a way that sort of opens those doors where we're looking at something as opposed to just reading or thinking. And, these histories have been around for a while now, but who is going to the academic archives to read theses on Ireland's connections to the transatlantic slave trade? Very few people. Yeah. Whereas maybe more might be interested to broach this subject through this visual medium.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to hearing more in connection with John Butts's painting and also from art history in general. Thank you very much, Susanne.
Oh, thanks so much for your time today, Neasa. It's been great talking to you.